Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on men as allies in the struggle for women's empowerment. My name is Nadeem Mahomed. I am a director and the knowledge lawyer in the employment law department, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, Chris Charter, who's the national practice head of the competition department at CDH, and Gift Kaba, who's an associate in our pro bono department. We're sitting here on the eve of Women's Month, which is August, which commemorates the march of a large group, thousands of women, diverse, multiracial group of women, who marched on the 9th of August 1956 on the Union buildings, demanding reprieve from laws that were both racist and sexist at the time. So I think the timing is quite important for this conversation to take place. And I'm going to start off maybe with a question that leads directly into the topic. The word allyship is used very often in many contexts, especially in relation to people who are marginalized. You have allies, people who are heterosexuals or straight, who say we're allies of LGBTQ people. You have the same with groups who are marginalized on the basis of race. It's also a word that's used very often in relation to women, men as allies to women. But what does this really mean? Maybe if I can ask you to interrogate the word and the concept, and what does it mean for you? I'll start with you, Chris.
Sure. Nadeem, look, I think it's a useful term. I've heard other terms which are far less useful. Man-ambassador, male champions for empowerment. And I think all of those run the risk of perpetuating the system where men are kind of placed on a pedestal and say, we're a champion for women's rights. And I think, to me, allyship in this context is, first and foremost, nothing more than creating an environment where we can interact with women and women can interact with men in a way which is mutually respectful and effectively, I think, comes down to building key relationships with people, recognizing them at face value and for their own worth. And then in the context of women's empowerment, just removing deliberately any sense of sexism from the atmosphere. I think if you can get that right to begin with, and it's less about, the systems we put in place and the protocols, etc. I think it's more just about saying we're all in this together. We're all stakeholders in the same game, and there really is no need not to allow anybody to have exactly the same responsibilities and opportunities as the next, and to treat everybody with respect and fairness. And I think if you can start with that, I think you're a long way towards being an ally, not just for women, but for sort of any a demographic in the workplace, and working together to share sort of in the mutual benefits of working together.
Gift, your thoughts on this?
I think firstly, Nadeem, I think at this point in time, there can be no question that women face, various, systemic challenges, in almost every environment and setting in our society. So we've absolutely got to acknowledge that. And I think if we are, I think it's, responsible, lawyers, responsible citizens and human beings, I think we've got no choice, but to commit to this significant cause and to commit ourselves to be allies, for change. But like Chris says, I think being an ally is not about, heroics or saviorism or dominating the conversation, but really more about commitment, accountability, and us making it a point that we walk shoulder to shoulder with women to find pragmatic, substantive ways to really dismantle, these long-standing societal systems, norms and practices that have prejudiced women for a very long time. So allyship to me is really about accountability, humility, and, finding a way, in an unwavering way to being able to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves about our societies and ourselves as human beings. And that's really about that. And I think, there are ways from an individual level, interpersonal level, and societal level that we can attribute what being an ally means to. And I think we can touch a little bit later on those.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think what comes out is that it's quite well established that there are quite definitive barriers for women thriving and flourishing in the workplace and in our societies. Even though we've made tremendous gains over the last 30 or 40 years, those problems still persist. The patriarchal order in some ways is still very present. But what's important, I think, Gift, as you mentioned, is nothing about us without us. So this idea where men as allies shouldn't replace women in terms of substituting their voice for their own, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And what would you say about that practically? How do men function as allies without usurping the agency of women? Because that in itself becomes highly problematic. And maybe kind of a double question, what does that look like practically and pragmatically in the workplace or in a firm like ours?
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges in exactly what you say. And I think maybe one can broadly accept. I know we live in a time when people, a lot of people tend to not accept the fact that there is difference between the genders, but I think to some extent there is. I think overall, and it's at the risk of being sort of generalistic about it, I think women tend to be more collaborative in their relationships, and their helpfulness in the workplace is more about collaboration and building relationships. Men try to help in the workplace and at home and in society generally by being more action oriented. Men also, and my male colleagues can forgive me for saying so, we generally have lower EQ than women, which means we tend to crave credit. We tend to and we want a little bit of limelight. We feel validated when we are recognized for things, and women sometimes downplay that. So we have those challenges, whereas women don't seek the kind of credit that men feel. So I think there are real things that we as men can do. And people use the term check your privilege. I think it can be a bit of a dangerous term because it and we can have a conversation about that. But I think just to understand that we come in with certain biases in the way we approach things, and we tend not to listen enough. And I think when you're talking about giving women a voice or in acknowledging that, is to acknowledge those differences in approach. And again, for me, it comes back to that sort of equal relationship, to say we all look at things differently. And I think if we can get to a point where we're not trying to mansplain, we're not trying to end every conversation by summing it up, when those points have been well made, and really kind of acknowledge where credit is due, because a lot of women will not self-promote to the same extent that men do. And I think it's important for men to be willing to acknowledge and maybe call other men out when they're taking the credit for someone else.
So the idea of standing up when you need to, stepping aside when you need to, and stepping down when you need to, and to be able to be present enough to know which is the most appropriate in a particular context.
I think education around this topic is quite important, but I'll touch on that, Nadeem. I think for me, practically, again, it goes back to what Chris and myself were chatting about earlier. You've got to, be accountable to yourself, as an individual first. I think your behavior. I think there are certain, ways or I think attitudes or values that you've got to adopt. I think number one, are you silent? Because in many ways, silent can be complicit, to unsavory behaviors. Like Chris said, if you come across at any of your spheres of influence, whether at home or in the office environment, an unsavory joke, a sexist joke, or or something like that, what do you do? Do you keep silent or play along to it? So if, in some way you let that kind of behavior thrive, then you are also, I think, contributing to the attitudes, right? Number two, just holding yourself accountable, watching your own behavior, as an individual. Do you create this space to women? Do you create an enabling environment? Do you listen to their concerns? Do you understand these issues, the challenges that they are going through? Do you listen without being defensive? And education, educating yourself. You've got to, I think, you need to understand the challenges that women go through. You need to understand their lived realities, and I think that's really one of the most significant ways that you can, play a role or contribute substantively to the change in attitudes. So I think those are really the things, practically for me, not being silent, holding yourself accountable, committing to education, and committing to being an ally in the sense of understanding and learning more about these issues and women's lived experiences.
Thanks, Gert. That's very insightful. I want to go back to a part that something that Chris mentioned. So, Chris, you mentioned some of these characteristics that are attached or are exhibited more prominently by one gender over the others. So, men tend not to have as high of an emotional intelligence radar as women do, and that comes with its own problems. And, in some ways, men are maybe louder and prouder in ways that are not always productive and that may marginalize women. And, there's been increasing research and data, especially in the social sciences, that these ideas of gender, while they're definitely true and they reflect our environment, they actually learned behaviors. So there's ways in which, because of the way a person is brought up, or the material they're exposed to, or the pop culture they watch, or the way in which their teachers or leaders exhibit themselves, they learn certain behaviors as being normal or natural for a particular gender. What type of culture do you think would help in either undoing that or creating new ideas around what these things mean? That men don't have to act in particular ways and women don't have to act in particular ways in order to demonstrate either masculinity, an authentic sense of masculinity or femininity.
Yeah, Nadeem, you pick up on I think a lot of challenges in terms of trying to navigate all of this. I absolutely agree. I think sexism, just like racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, whatever it is not our natural state. I think it's learned, and it's learned through societal structures. And I think it's useful to think about sexism as a system, which does, of course, privilege men, but it also polices men in a way. So I think, to really sort of start to break down these systems requires, I think, men and women, but men in particular in this context, to be particularly self-aware and to just reflect and understand when you've had a reflex sexist reaction, or to be aware when other men are doing that, and maybe less to tolerate that, and more to be a positive influence and say, this is, and it is a difficult situation, because I think, women don't want, and they don't necessarily need to be helped by men.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that comes out of the interactions that I've seen sometimes when we talk about, how can men be champions for women empowerment, is we have the situation where we're trying to do all these positive things, and at worst it's virtue signaling, but even at best, I don't think it's helped the situation. I don't know if anybody saw that movie, Formula One, which just hit the
Not yet.
But it's not a great movie. It's a fun movie, but there's a very interesting scene where there is a woman who is on the pit crew, which I'm led to believe is unusual, and like anybody on a pit crew might do, she makes a mistake, and she is castigated for it, and then Brad Pitt's character stands up for her and says, "Hey guys, leave her alone. You know, she's doing her best." Seemed like the right thing to do, but in a subsequent scene, the same woman comes to Brad Pitt while he's half naked in an ice bath, as he would be, and says, "Look, I appreciate what you did, but don't do it again." Why is that? She said, it's because it makes it look like I need your help. You know, and I think that's the balance we have to draw here. So it really does, I think, come back to being, to building those relationships and just interacting on an equal footing. I think if you can start getting that right, and it's not always easy. Yeah. Sounds simple, not always easy. I think we're on the right trajectory.
I think, Chris, that an important point there is that for any marginalized group, for the person who's an outsider to that group or does not share any significant identity markers with that group, they should be cautious of a condescending paternalism developing, where they may have whatever noble intentions around standing up or saying certain things, but in a way it shouldn't come across as suffocating or removing the agency again of the people that you're talking about.
The views and information expressed are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily present those of the firm. All content is provided for general purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. We make no representations, warranties, or guarantees, whether expressed or implied, that the content on our podcast is accurate, complete, up-to-date, or reflects the current law. We accept no responsibility for any loss or damage, whether direct or consequential, arising from reliance on the information which is presented here.